Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Well, today we are going to be talking about Wraithguards and Spiritseers. Partially because we don't talk about the Eldar a whole often, and because I just finished Rites of War, quite possibly the only good piece of media the Eldar have ever received. So, I felt inspired. Anywho, the Wraithguard, let's begin there, as the Spiritseers really are an accompaniment to the Wraithguard. At first glance, these may appear to be some sort of Eldar battlesuit, or perhaps a bipedal war machine. But reality is far more macabre. Much like the Thalax warriors we covered last week, there is a glimmer of life within the Wraithguard, or, well, technically, unlife, actually, as they are piloted not by an Eldar, not even by the mutilated living remnants of an Eldar, but rather they are possessed by the spirit of a long-dead Eldar warrior, whose soul stone, and thus in turn his spirit, has now been embedded within the wraithbone construct known as a Wraithguard. There is also a similar but larger construct known as the Wraith Lord, who is solely occupied by the spirits of great fallen Eldar heroes, those who have committed some grand deed in service of their craftworlds. They are given the honor of piloting, if that's even the correct term, possessing really makes more sense, the Wraith Lords, both because they are expected to be able to handle its multitude of weaponry to the utmost efficiency, but also because being bonded to a Wraith construct is not necessarily a pleasant experience. All Eldar fear to be trapped into a singular path, the path of the warrior from which there is no escape. Eldar spend their entire lives pursuing countless different vocations, flitting from one to another so as to avoid ever becoming fully possessed with one pursuit of greatness. This is due to the last time they fully gave themselves over to a singular pursuit, and gave birth to a chaos god. Those few who are trapped into a warrior path are known as exarchs, and are of course both lauded for their heroics and combat capabilities, but also viewed as tragic figures within the Eldar race. The Wraith Lords are much the same thing, but this is something even worse, as this is not merely a spirit put to rest, temporarily used for combat. This is a spirit that is placed within a great war machine and set to stride across the battlefield as a vengeful god. The risk that the spirit might find this new occupation just a little bit too appealing is great indeed. And whilst it is dangerous and deeply undesirable for an Eldar to fall into a fixed path, it is even worse for one of the dead, as they will be entrapped within it for eternity. An eternity of war, bloodshed, and pain, which will only inevitably end in their own complete destruction, and subsequent devouring by she who thirsts. This eventual fall also becomes, in essence, a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more the Eldar longs for battle, the more likely he is to participate in it, the more likely he is to grow ferocious, furious, and uncontrollable, charging at the enemy, placing himself in yet greater danger, thereby inevitably hastening their own demise and the potential destruction of their spirit stone, the only thing still protecting them from Slaanesh. These spirits that can no longer be controlled are entombed within special wraith constructs known as wraith blades. These are focused near exclusively on close quarters combat, a cold and calculated practical choice. Since the construct can no longer be controlled effectively, it is better that they be allowed to spend their fury on the enemy as effectively as possible, allowing them to charge into combat whilst equipping them with the best possible chance of getting back out of combat again, by equipping them with a variety of so-called ghost weaponry. These are weapons ranging from axes to swords to glaives, which have a small spirit stone imbued within them as well. The host consciousness guides the weapon unerringly towards the enemy, going great lengths to make up for the otherwise rather cumbersome and ungainly nature of a wraith construct. Many of these units will also be equipped with a force shield, to give them the best possible opportunity to weather incoming enemy fire. The hope is that by at least giving the construct all the advantages the Eldar can, its inevitable and final demise will be put off a little while longer. And if the spirit within can no longer be controlled safely anyways, it might as well be used to the utmost effect. But the faith of a Wraith Blade is, of course, still yet one that the Eldar would wish to avoid wherever possible. The Wraithguards are therefore instead equipped with ranged weaponry. These are Wraith Cannons, a miniaturized version of the much heavier D-Cannon. A weapon that quite literally rips a hole in space and time for a nanosecond, tearing everything around it into the hole, ripping anything and everything apart. Infantry or anything mortal and fleshy is of course instantaneously destroyed, and even armored vehicles can be torn apart by the sudden and intense, not even gravitic, but reality-based anomaly. A further advantage of the Wraith Cannon is that it doesn't really need to be aimed. When you punch a tiny hole in space and time, you don't need to be precise, which is good because the Wraithguards can't really see the world like you and I. There are no photoreceptors on the Wraithguard because it wouldn't really help. They don't see through the construct. The spirit within rather connects to the psychoactive material in the Wraithguard, the so-called wraithbone. Although, well, considering GW's recent retcon declaring that the wraithbone is not actually a psychically active material at all, but rather some form of alloy of base metals, I guess we don't know how they really work anymore. But for the purpose of this video, we are simply going to assume the GW are morons, who haven't really been paying much attention to their own setting recently. The psycho-reactive metal allows the spirit to possess the construct, allowing the wraithbone to move as if it was an approximation of the spirit's old limbs. Even so, the connection is, and will always be, somewhat tenuous, as the dead have different priorities and operate on a bit of a different schedule than the rest of us. And with the connection as well being difficult to maintain, only possible due to the wraithbone, they tend to be sluggish, slow, and their view of the world around them fuzzy and indistinct at best. Now, this would normally be absolute suicide for any other regular infantry unit, but again, the Wraithguards aren't regular infantry. They're already dead, and their wraithbone construct bodies are very, very tough. There's no heart to puncture here. There is no wound that can bleed out. There is no fear whatsoever of any sort of glancing wound or flesh wounds or anything like that. The only way to take a Wraithguard down is to destroy it utterly, to blow off its limb, to crush its entire body, or destroy its spirit stone vessels. And even if one knows what to aim for, the body itself is incredibly durable, meaning that these are the perfect assault troopers for a race that normally do not have a whole lot in the way of tough, durable units. However, using the Wraithguards in this fashion is a difficult choice for the Eldar, as it risks, of course, the permanent destruction of the Spirit Stones, which in turn would risk the liberation of the spirit within. The moment an Eldar spirit is freed from its Spirit Stone, it only has one place to go: the realm of Slaanesh. So, the destruction of a Wraithguard is not merely the death of a warrior, it is the final death. A death that ends in, quite literally, endless torment for all eternity at the fangs and hands and teeth of a demon goddess. So yeah, deploying Wraithguards is not done lightly. And even though they would be perfectly suited for soaking up enemy firepower, they are very rarely deployed for that precise purpose, instead being guided towards their targets by psychers like warlocks or Spiritseers, allowing them to use their extremely devastating long-range weaponry to maximum effect, whilst, relatively speaking, minimizing damage to the Wraith construct. And considering the risks involved, an unending eternity of the most ballsack-crushing torment, the decision to deploy Wraith constructs is never one made lightly. When the dead of a craftworld march to war, it is usually a sign of deep desperation, or if the Eldar believe that they have some plan, some operation that absolutely requires their deployment for the achievement of some great goal. The only real exception to this rule is the one craftworld that deploys Wraithguards in significant numbers in virtually all of their military operations. That, of course, is Iyanden, and not because they have a particular fetish for watching their grandfathers die and be tortured for eternity, but because the overwhelming majority of Iyanden's population is dead, after the craftworld decided it could take a Tyranid hive fleet head on. That worked out exactly like you think it did, and now sees Iyanden deploy significant numbers of these undead warriors in the ranks of their fighting forces, relying upon them as a cornerstone foundation of all of their military strategy. It was also Iyanden that first started using Spiritseers en masse. Indeed, at one point, they were unique to Iyanden, although these days I believe other craftworlds use them as well. As we already mentioned, Wraithguards have a difficult time perceiving the real world, as they view it through a tenuous warp connection rather than through any wraithbone optics. This is why Wraithguards are often deployed alongside a guiding psyker, in most cases a warlock, a younger psychic adept of the Eldar species. They are able to psychically commune with the Wraithguard and show them his own sight, and guide them towards the enemy that most needs smiting with half a dozen black holes at any given time. But warlocks are not specialized in this form of warfare. They are not made or trained to direct Wraithguards, and in many cases they will struggle communicating with these ancient long-lost spirits, in the same way that a modern-day human being might have a very hard time communicating with and understanding someone from, say, the 900s. Not to mention the psychic strain placed upon the warlock if he is needed to communicate with the more belligerent spirits, those with more strident grievances with whomever they are currently fighting. Some of these spirits are so long lost to the path of the warrior that their mere proximity can often be felt as corrosive to other Eldar. Just like proximity to exarchs is usually avoided unless strictly speaking necessary. And then, of course, there's the uncomfortable nature of this service in general. Again, a Wraithguard construct is a dead person possessing a wraithbone shell. As far as the Eldar are concerned, this is, in essence, a desecration of the dead. This is grave robbery. This is a deeply unethical, borderline immoral act carried out only in times of extreme need. But no matter how much one might tell themselves that this is necessary, it's very rarely fun to actively engage in something that every fiber of your being is screaming at you at being wrong, unnatural, vile, repulsive, and evil. And for a species as sensitive, both psychologically and psychically, as the Eldar, this is a very, very uncomfortable spot to be put in for a warlock. Considering, therefore, the distasteful nature of the duty, and the fact that whilst in psychic communion with the dead, constantly thinking that they are icky and horrific abominations against nature, which might strain the communication somewhat, Iyanden, the world where the dead outnumbered the living, swiftly realized that it needed a special kind of seer to deal with this sort of duty, both to rouse the dead to war effectively, and also to keep them calm, to keep them under control, to lessen the chances of the dead becoming too addicted to warfare, or simply falling into hatred upon seeing what little remained of their once great people. These potential caretakers already existed, although this would be a very, very different role for them, as the Spiritseers, before they became the Spiritseers of today, were caretakers, gardeners of a sort. They were the Eldar that were taking care of the Great Spirit Network, the Infinity Circuit, the place where all Eldar went after they died. This was before the fall of the Eldar, intended to be in essence a form of vast Gestalt consciousness, a source of advice, of guidance for the Eldar as a species, a repository of knowledge. But then they anal-sexed Slaanesh into existence, and it became instead a final refuge, a graveyard that was a salvation to the Eldar spirits, as much as it was also an inescapable prison for those souls trapped within it. To leave the Infinity Circuit is to be devoured by Slaanesh. To stay inside of the Infinity Circuit is to slowly but surely lose one's individuality, until the spirit is simply subsumed amongst the other countless millions of Eldar spirits. Not an ideal solution by any stretch of the imagination, but significantly better than forever of torture. This new nature of the Infinity Circuit placed entirely new demands and strains upon the Spiritseers, who now were no longer maintaining a advisory body, a Gestalt consciousness that only a few decided or needed to join, but now they needed to manage every dead Eldar, attempting to maintain as much of the spirit's individuality as possible, keeping them, in a sort of kind of sense, alive and honored, even as the Infinity Circuit were used for things it was never truly intended for. These problems, of course, grew significantly larger once the Eldar as a species began to dwindle more and more, as they found themselves in an ever more hostile cosmos. The Eldar had long since lost dominion over the galaxy, and were now in many cases actively hunted. Those few craftworlds like Iyanden or Biel-Tan that dreamt of a resurgent Eldar race, of a return to glory, were often humbled with catastrophic consequences, like with Iyanden. Now, the Spiritseers did not merely need to maintain this vast and eternal prison, this graveyard, but they also needed to rouse the spirits to war. Again, the Infinity Circuit and the spirits within are not simply living like we would view it. They are very much so dead. They have very much so different concerns and different ways of viewing the world and thinking about things. They no longer have corporal forms, which also affects them, and they might simply be dominated as well by base emotions like anguish, hatred, or malice, depending upon how they passed from this world. Again, this is why the Infinity Circuit was intended to be a much smaller undertaking than what it became due to necessity. Thus, it is challenging to organize these spirits. It is challenging to rouse them to war. It is challenging to speak to them, to pick the correct souls with which to commune, etc., etc. All of this requires a great deal of expertise and a deft touch, so as not to upset the dead any more than necessary, as again, all of this is in essence tantamount to grave robbery and desecration of the honored deceased. This places a great burden upon the Spiritseers, and, to make it significantly worse, of course, all Eldar usage of psychic powers is inherently dangerous, as Slanesh is always seeking out Eldar souls, and any lapse in concentration or breach in mental discipline may endanger not only the seer's soul, but all who are connected to the seer. Even worse, when actively communing with the Infinity Circuit, of course. And they need to maintain all of these wards of secrecy and protection against demons, whilst negotiating with thousands, if not millions, of screaming, babbling spirits, many of whom have long since lost any real sense of self. This presents yet another challenge, because a spirit may only offer its services in the protection of a craft world willingly. This is the only reason why the Eldar ever even allow this sort of thing, is because they view this as a voluntary action. The dead volunteer to serve, fully understanding the risks and dangers entailed in doing so. It is a noble sacrifice that the dead are willing to commit yet again to honor their yet living brethren. But when is a spirit too far gone to be able to actually consent properly? When is a spirit that may have been trapped within the Infinity Circuit for thousands of years considered to no longer be able to judge for itself what the risks are, what the dangers are? Perhaps the spirit is simply seeking a release from the Infinity Circuit. Perhaps it is simply overcome with rage, grief, and anguish, and so seeks a final end. If so, is it moral to use this spirit as a warrior? Would it not endanger itself, endanger others? Not to mention, of course, again, the final cost of a wraith construct being completely destroyed. Is the spirit capable of fully fathoming the danger inherent in volunteering? These are all judgment calls that must be made by the Spiritseer, balancing the craftworld's need for warriors with the Ancient One's rights and dignity, and judging whether or not they are still able to make informed decisions. Because if the spirit is not able of doing so, then it is no longer truly willing, at which point the Spiritseer is not merely calling upon a volunteer ancestor to wage war for the craftworld again. The Spiritseer is binding a soul, unwillingly, incapable of consent, into servitude, into a weapons platform. That is where it truly transforms into the macabre, the abuse of the dead that the Eldar fear. They would prefer to simply disconnect from all of it, but that leaves another calculus to be solved. What is the life of a living Eldar compared to a dead Eldar? What is the life of a living Eldar compared to the potential loss of the soul of a dead Eldar? What is the value of civilization, a craftworld like Iyanden, compared to its dead, already enraged, already filled with hatred, already called upon too often? When does necromancy cease being an absolutely morally abhorrent act and become an evil necessity? And considering Iyanden found itself on the verge of extermination, 3 times now? You can imagine the kind of self-control that is required of a Spiritseer to not simply command the dead's obedience when the craftworld is on its 4th and possibly final bout of mass extinction. And honestly, Iyanden has probably erred on the wrong side of asking more than once, considering how reliant they are upon their dead friends to not join them. The Spiritseers will then, of course, after rousing the dead, join them on the battlefield, where they will perform much the same role as the aforementioned warlocks, but they tend to be better at it. Having significantly more experience than the warlocks, they are better equipped to guide the wraith constructs into combat, better equipped to understand their sight as they themselves have seen through their bodiless eyes, and they are also more able to resist the various pitfalls of commanding dead troops, as it's not merely just the actual revulsion of doing so, there are genuine psychic dangers as well, not merely psychological. See, whilst as mentioned already, you need to target the spirits with enough cognizant understanding of themselves and their nature in order to be able to ask them to march to war, right? But everyone makes mistakes on occasion, or the line between understanding and not is so tenuous that it is very difficult to tell whether or not a particular spirit is on one side or the other. In these cases, the soul could easily get confused, and believing itself to still be alive, seek to possess a body yet again, not a construct of wraithbone, but one of flesh and blood. There have even been documented occasions of spirits attempting to possess spirit seekers deliberately, seeking either to bring on some message to the Eldar in an act of desperation, or simply because it wishes to feel what it is like to be alive again. This happens not quite as often as the mistaken possessions, but it is still a significant danger that Spiritseers need to constantly be on the alert against. And as if all of that wasn't bad enough, the constant psychological strain placed upon the Spiritseers, their constant wrestling with the ethical dilemmas of their position, we add to all of this the rest of Eldar society viewing Spiritseers as basically criminals at worst, or massive deviants at absolute best. They view them as unholy creations, as Eldar messing with powers that should not be messed with, as, again, necromancers, as people who play with the dead for their own amusement. Even craftworlds like Iyanden, who fully understand the necessity of using wraith constructs in these ghost warriors, can never quite give up their superstition, their judgments against the Spiritseers and any who consort with the dead, leaving Spiritseers isolated both in the real world and in the spirit world. It is a heavy burden that most Eldar would probably wish to avoid whenever possible. But in the case of many craftworlds with ever-dwindling numbers of warriors, there simply might not be an option anymore. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening. I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.